rules in advance unless you know that there's a specific practice that is demonstrably almost always harmful. Instead, rely on rules that are more flexible. We would call standards, right? A standard of consumer welfare. But also importantly, where you can, rely not on a special regulator, rely on general regulation. That is, if you can find laws that apply to all people in the market that are applied by a general purpose regulator, that will be less likely to be captured by special interests. That generally means a consumer protection regulator, the antitrust, the competition authority. Those are far more reliable than are a specialty communications regulator, which, by the way, have always regulated monopolies and are always tending to produce monopolies, as Mike's example of the airline regulator in the United States demonstrated. And finally, on that point, if you can, don't rely on the government to do this. Use a bottom-up process. There are processes that have been tried, for example, in the Netherlands and many countries that have very strong commitments to net neutrality, where the first recourse is not to the government, but is to vehicles that resolve disputes privately, and then only where necessary go to the government. And finally, in closing, when you ask most people about net neutrality and they say yes, what they really mean is competition. They want more choices in broadband. They aren't happy with the status quo, and for good reason. But they're different concepts, and we should, as Mike was saying, we should be focused on that. If we had spent even a small fraction of the effort that has been wasted arguing about net neutrality or zero rating on deployment, we would be in a much better condition today. Why isn't there a dynamic coalition on deployment? Why aren't we talking about the ways that governments make it very difficult to deploy around the world? Why is it that O3B, the satellite company that has their tent out there, they're providing wireless backhaul services, connecting wireless towers around the world with their satellite service? Why is it that you have to use a connection from space to do that? Well, the answer is it's because governments have made it so difficult to deploy good, reliable internet access to connect towers and cell phones and all the internet infrastructure of countries around the world. Those are what we should be focused on.
Thank you, Barry. So after the introductions, now is the fun time. Sorry, I forgot the last maybe. I was excited about the debate. So last but not least, maybe Camp Bob. Go ahead.
Thank you. So in the maybe camp, which is actually not about maybe, I think it's, so I clearly align with Mike. It's the how, but that also is what we've heard from the yes and no. So let me just back up a little bit and try to pull up. What are we worried about? What's the problem we're trying to solve? The problem we're trying to solve, and again, when I was still at the FCC, we were faced with the problem, right? Where there was a carrier that was blocking SIP ports because they didn't want competition from voice over IP, right? And we very quickly, it came up as a complaint in an informal complaint process. We identified it. We dealt with the operator that was doing that, the telco that was doing that. It was a small rural telco, and they stopped. And we didn't even go through the full process to impose a fine, so we called it a voluntary contribution to the U.S. Treasury. But what we learned from that was that there are problems that have to be solved. There will be efforts for either, in this case, it was both anti-competitive behavior and anti-consumer behavior. So you have to worry about that. Right? But the way what we did, what evolved from that, were a set of what we called net neutrality principles. And by the way, I agree with the phrase net neutrality is not very useful because it means so many different things to different people. And Eduardo pointed out some of these, and I'm actually going to come back to one of those. So the fundamental principles there, again, they were not ex-ante rules in advance. They were a set of principles that then became, over time, embedded in FCC rulemaking. But because of the idiosyncrasy, the uniqueness of U.S. law, 3 times the court said to the FCC, oh, you can't do it that way. And so what we ended up with in the U.S. because of the way the law is written is not something that I would recommend anywhere else, because I believe it is too restrictive in terms of ex ante. But our principles, number 1, anybody, and we did it from a bottom-up consumer, because it also protects competition. Anybody should be able to connect any device to the network of their choice as long as it didn't harm the network. 2, you have access and a right to have access to all content, assuming it's legal and that it's not, for example, child pornography. 3, you have the right to download and use applications, right? Because that also is about speaking. And number 4, consumers need sufficient information to make informed decisions, to be able to know what they're buying, and then in terms of internet access, and then be able to see, are they getting what they thought they bought? Right? Some basic principles. And there were a couple of cases actually with complaints based upon bad behavior in which the FCC responded very, very quickly. But again, those things went to, again, what's the problem you're solving for? The concern about anti-consumer behavior and anti-competitive behavior. And then there were some other things that evolved, and Eduardo talked about one of them, which is network management. And that actually becomes really important. And I'll explain that more in a moment. And then there's the issue of innovation and flexibility. The internet is moving very, very, very fast. So you do worry about innovation. So what I like to do is go back to Net Mundial 2 years ago here, and in the looking forward document, right, there was a statement that said, while there was no agreement on net neutrality, there was consensus and total agreement on what we referred to as the open internet. And the open internet had a set of fundamental principles, and it's, again, really important. The right to connect your own device, the right to access any content, the right to use any application, the right to have information to make choices, but also recognize the importance of appropriate, important word, network management, and also elsewhere in the document there was a reflection and an endorsement of innovation, and the basic principles within Net Mundial, principles, not the going forward document, principles was probably the strongest statement about the freedom of expression in any similar document, because it talked about the right to speak, not just on the internet, but in any medium. So if you incorporate those principles, they are principles, and use techniques that can address bad behavior to protect consumers, to protect competition, to protect innovation, to protect freedom of expression, I believe that that's a much more effective way of doing it than having ex-ante rules that during the discussion session I will give you concrete examples of how ex-ante rules are harming innovation and also ending up inadvertently harming consumers, particularly because we don't know and we can't predict how the internet is going to evolve.
Thank you, Bob. So now it's the fun time. So when we first started, I told you this is different from the other net neutrality panels, and I wasn't lying, because this is going to be a debate, and we have six panelists in 3 camps, and now they will discuss and they will ask each other questions. So each group has 8 minutes to ask questions and an answer. So I just start with Mike, and from the Maybe group.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, since I do have to leave in about 5 minutes for another panel. One of the things that I like to compare this debate to is airlines. I mentioned the demise of the Civil Aeronautics Board because there wasn't enough competition and there wasn't enough choice. So for both sides, I'd like to ask what lessons you draw, and in particular, should there be airline seat neutrality so that every seat sells for the same price and they're all the same class of seating? That's a facetious question, but.
Well, I will begin with my own observation of irony at having been invited to attend a panel, been reprimanded for coming to express my opinion on the subject, and to find instead what is offered as being the appropriate path to embrace the now discredited Washington solution of the 1990s to simply deregulate our way to deployment and freedom. So, we all have our little ironies that we appreciate. With regard to the specific question, I have to say that having spent some considerable time in airlines at the moment, having been subjected to their non-disclosure to what has become the eternal slippery slope, especially for a gentleman as portly as myself, with regard to seat size, I have to say that I do think that some basic minimum standard enforceable so that I as a consumer can understand what I am going to buy, can make reliable purchases, is in fact pro-consumer and necessary. I think the airlines provide an incredibly instructive example, particularly since we have reconsolidated our way back to a non-competitive state, which shows the complexity of the problem, the need for some regulatory oversight, some basic ex ante rules to provide sufficient certainty while balanced against too rigid a regime. I am criticized apparently for ignoring facts on the ground, but I would say that the realities on the ground reflect the complications of reality and show that the rules in network neutrality, at least those adopted in the United States, as well as those adopted in other countries, arose in response to specific circumstances where they are subject to fine-tuning and discussion. I do not see that the internet has crashed and burned because engineers are no longer capable of concluding deals, but providing some basic rules about what may not be included in those handshake deals, or requiring that you talk to people your bosses who are not engineers might tell you not to deal with, serves to keep the internet running smoothly.
So this is Mike's time to use as he sees fit.
I asked the question.
So, well, indeed, but you should stop me when you decide that I haven't responded. It's just as Harold didn't actually respond to your answer, to your question. But look, I mean, since Harold brings up the example
Really a good thing that you're over here and he's over
Oh, that
there.
was quite deliberate. Since Harold brought up the example of airlines, I mean, the bottom line is that
I didn't bring up the example of airlines. That was
okay,
a question.
Fine. So Mike asked that question, and Harold responded. The reality is that airline prices have fallen 50% in the last 30 years. That's just a fact, right? The fact is that that changing how we regulated airlines brought them within the reach of people who could never afford to fly, right? So it's not that they were deregulated. The government, of course, still regulates them. Of course, it still deals with safety issues and consumer protection. It simply changed how it regulated them, and what it did was to abolish the special regulator that had made airlines a monopoly or an oligopoly, and instead we have a competitive market. There were no new airlines started while we had a special purpose regulator. Today, we have a different approach, and so to apply that to the example of the internet, I'm not saying that there isn't a role for government. Harold puts up a straw man when he says that that we're claiming that there shouldn't be any role or that we're arguing for complete deregulation. We're simply saying, be careful how you design rules. So let me give you examples of rules that I do think we should have ex ante. Don't lie to your customer, right? Good rule to have. It's a good rule to have because we know that lying to your customer is really not ever a good thing. But when you get beyond that, you get into the more difficult trade-offs about how you regulate networks, and especially areas where we don't know what the effects are and the trade-offs about zero rating and whether it's important for a carrier to be able to offer a non-neutral offering to attract consumers, right? There, we need flexibility, and that's where we want a standard that we don't write in advance. We apply it as it goes.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if I can try to take this back to the internet, but drawing on airports and airplanes, a very classic example is something almost everyone experienced, and it's not a US example. When you go to an airport, sometimes you get free Wi-Fi. Sometimes they make you watch an ad for a particular company that's supporting the Wi-Fi. Is this, or you have to pay for the service and in order to get with the right to see it without having an advertisement. Is this discriminatory? Is this favoring one provider over another? Well, you could, one advertising point. Well, you could say anyone can buy that ad and make it open in that way from a competitive standpoint, or we could regulate and say you cannot have this particular practice. I actually don't know, because the airports are doing different things, what ultimately will be the best solution, and maybe different ones will try different things. But what's striking to me is that I think many consumers find this is an acceptable compromise, and they would rather save the money, and it increases their options because they have the ability to do that. The bigger concern I have is this. We now, if we have rules, we focus on this practice and said, is it discriminatory? To me, the real question is this practice, allowing this practice, good for consumers? Does it increase their choice? Does it allow them to reduce the amounts they pay? Because if services don't count against your data cap, you can reduce the amount you pay. And what is the service it's buying in? Do they have to pay money, or is it an open platform? T-Mobile makes it open to any music service. It's just something they're trying to differentiate it. They're not trying to get money out of it. And in one of the cases in Slovenia, it was a very small cloud service, not one of the big giants, called Hanger Mappa, that was trying to push its way in and trying to find a way to get a purchase in the market that's very crowded by established players. And so by looking at, was it good for Slovenian consumers, not is it violating some abstract concept of discrimination, to bar zero rating of Hanger Mappa cloud services? I think focusing on the consumers and the real issues of how that plays out will just make a much better policy, and I think ex-ante rules focus you on the abstract principle, not on the real effect.
So I think I have a little bit of time to ask more questions, picking up on...
Before that, Eduardo wants to...
Oh, okay.
comment.
Well, no, I'm sort of trying to ask questions, picking up on Mike because he had to leave. I think we have a few more minutes left for maybe to ask questions of yes and no. So, but I want maybe Eduardo. So one of the that Harold just said was that you need ex ante, but you also need flexibility. Christopher just said, you do need some regulations. Barron said, well, we absolutely have to, on an ex ante, you can't lie to people, right? So for both sides, right, what would be, for the no, what would be appropriate ex ante, and for the yes, how do you ensure flexibility?
Well, thank you for the question, because it's exactly what I want to raise right now. I think that, and I will ask another question. To answer your question, for the yes is, in a regulation, you can include basic principles, in fact, basic human rights principles that are in international standards, in constitutions, like the non-discriminatory principle, non-censorship, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. So some of the regulations of net neutrality include these kind of principles. So one of my questions is why we are going to be against a principle, net neutrality, that translate into this area some of the general principles that defends basic human rights, like the non-discriminatory principle. I think that at some point, and I'm going back to my first words when I talk here, is my feeling is that people who are in the camp of the no are more in the know of the regulation of what I call the network management. and this is different. I would agree with that. I would agree that if we want to have in advance a very specific regulation on how to manage the congestion, for example, maybe that will be a problem. But if at the end of the day, the way that you are managing the network is against one of the basic principles, well, you are in trouble there. But I would say that if you are in the no camp because you believe that the management could not be regulated in advance by the law, the management of the traffic, I would say, well, I'm more on a maybe. But I think that it is possible to put a regulation that says yes, with basic principles that in fact are principles that we recognize for any content that we want to deliver.
So what would be? Thank you, Eduardo. That's actually, I think.
There's a bunch of easy ones that are pretty well established. Transparency, the making clear what the principles are, making people honor them, and basic consumer protection terms. Fraud is always bad. I think that there is some room for baseline technical capabilities to make sure that different things operate as expected. We need to make sure that those standards morph over time. What we're discovering, one of the things that's badly misunderstood is that if we really want an open environment with third parties providing services, you have to say, if someone brings an app and says, I'm doing these things in ways that comply with this system, you have to have a way to validate that they're telling the truth. Because a lot of them have incentives to cut corners. There's a good example I know. There's a mapping function. It is, engineers recognize that geo-satellite mapping data is more accurate than the other way, which is you look at the local cell towers, measure your distance, and figure out where you are. And they use the data on an ongoing basis to improve the information by recursively feeding it in. But they require you to code how you got the data, from a satellite or from a cell tower. There was one company that said, our product is so good that even though we do it from cell towers, we're going to code it as satellite data because it's the quality, and that's bad for consumers. You have to have a means in the architecture for actually making sure that people are doing what they say that they're doing, that the architecture requires them to do. And this is, if we're going to have a world in which it's not all provided by one company, you have to have the means for testing and actually validating these things to make sure the system as a whole works properly.
So I'm dying to hear what Harold says about building flexibility into his approach. But let me just tell you how I do it, because in addition to what Chris just said, I would say two things. Number one, I really don't know what the right answer is. I mean, that is fundamentally my point, but I'll give you two suggestions about how to do it. Number one, in many cases, when we talk about regulation, it's not necessarily about banning it. So the question might be, you could have a rebuttable presumption. You could say, we think that this practice is very likely to be harmful, but we're not sure, so we're not going to ban it completely, but we will at least set a default presumption that it might be harmful, and then allow it to be rebutted. That would be, in general, the most that I would want to do with business practices that are not deceptive or clearly harmful. Number two, because I don't know what the right answer is, and because it might vary from country to country and context to context, that's why I emphasize my point about who decides. And I would like to see these decisions made not generally by the legislature or a regulator, whether it's a special regulator or a general regulator. I'd like to see these decisions made in a multi-stakeholder context whenever possible, so that you could have a standard that would be enforced. It would make the regulator's job much simpler, because then consumer protection regulator simply enforces the standard, holds companies to it, but the details, which are hard, are worked out by the multi-stakeholder approach with people like Harold sitting at the table. Harold, what do you think?
I'm not sure why from Baron's perspective, I'm the only person at the table, but especially since I basically agree with Eduardo. I think that we have history of regulation being done right. We have history of regulation being done wrong. We have history of where the creation of flexibility, the problems of post hoc regimes typically go to, having argued this previously in this very context, go to complaints about uncertainty, complaints that without some specific clear rules about what is and isn't permissible. The companies do not know how to invest. The problem of without some clear guidelines, every complaint begins with a fight over whether the conduct, whether the agency even has reason to engage in an examination of the conduct. These are problems where, at least with regard to everybody but Barron, we are talking about degree. And I think that we can argue where in the swing of the regulatory pendulum things ought to go. But Eduardo was quite correct. I will just add one response, though, to Chris, which is I think that determining consumer welfare is not so simple a matter. It is not simply a microeconomic what lowers a cost, and from a pro-competitive standpoint, it is not simply can you determine whether there are some set of balancing efficiencies. This is why I believe that certain principles, like the no blocking principle, must be absolute, and that where we invite balancing for a very limited class of principles, such as either deceptive practices or blocking specifically, that those practices are inherently harmful, and I think we do have sufficient information to label a very small class of conduct like the blocking of VoIP calls and like the blocking of any phone call to be inherently harmful.
Just a second. So,
No,
but before that.
So where are we time?
Okay, yeah. Just to clarify, so we have half an hour left, and I want to leave 15 minutes to each group to make their conclusions. And I'll skip my questions because this debate is going really well. So you have 15 minutes, and I want to divide it to 3. Like each group have 5 minutes to ask their questions and answer the other's question. So I'm just like resetting my stopwatch, and your 5 minutes starts.
Yeah, but it will be less than 5 minutes. And if
Okay,
you
but
want to complement.
use that time to ask questions to
Yes,
these
no,
guys.
I think that we are almost convincing Bering to come and sit in this side of the desk, because what I just heard is that you do not oppose to a net neutrality regulation. You opposed more on process. You don't like the regulation coming from the legislature. You don't like the regulation coming from regulators, specific regulators or general regulators. This is what you said, and this is what I understood. So, and you prefer a multi-stakeholder mechanisms that implement the net neutrality principles. Maybe I understood incorrectly, but this is what I heard. But if that is the case, we need to think in advance on how you are going, or how we can implement that idea, the idea of multi-stakeholder involvement in the definition of net neutrality in advance. And I would say that in a democracy, we have that mechanism, and in a democracy, the mechanism is in Congress. I totally oppose if the regulator or the legislature start drafting net neutrality regulation without hearing all the stakeholders that are involved. But as soon as they invite everybody, the business sector, the academics, the civil society, the human rights defenders, and so on and so forth, then we have to have something coming, an output coming from that process, which could be a multi-stakeholder, or should be, or have to be a multi-stakeholder process. So I think, Bering, that you can sit in this side and come with us and say, yes, I want a regulation, but I want a regulation coming from a specific process. Thank you.
No camp to ask their questions and answer.
First of all, thank you, Eduardo. That's very gracious of you. And I'm glad that we're not arguing, and this is actually a friendly debate. I want to share with you, just to explain my answer. I'm going to read you something, and then I'll tell you who said it. Open, transparent, multi-stakeholder processes, when appropriately structured, can provide the flexibility, speed, and decentralization necessary to address internet policy challenges. The document goes on to say, flexibility is critical to resolve internet policy issues, and talks about how technology changes. Now, that you might think that was coming from tech freedom, but that is actually coming from the Obama administration's 2012 Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights white paper. Right? There's a lot of good stuff in there about talking about how difficult it is for Eduardo's preferred model of a Congress to come together in a democratic process and write rules, because we're not talking, this is not the 19th century, we're talking about technology that changes and about issues that are very difficult for the political process to get right. So the reason that I prefer these issues to be resolved, not through government, but whenever possible, through multi-stakeholder processes, and sometimes through industry codes of conduct, and it depends how that works out, is because those alone, as the Obama administration said, provide flexibility. So to be concrete, in the United States, this debate about net neutrality has been insanely frustrating for me because it's really been an unnecessary debate to a very large degree. There is no company in America that I'm aware of that actually has said they intend to block user traffic. In fact, they've said consistently, broadband providers have always been willing to say, of course we agree to basic transparency, disclosure, no blocking requirements. The question is always on the margin. What does it mean to block? How does it apply in more difficult circumstances? Those are the areas where you need flexibility, which is why, Eduardo, will you hear me agree with you? And in some sense I do, because to a large degree, these debates could be avoided, and in many countries, like the Netherlands, have been, where you've got a multi-stakeholder code that is agreed upon and then is enforced by the government, where the government doesn't have to do the hard work of coming up with strict, rigid ex-ante rules to deal with those hard cases. So does that make sense as my answer?
So what's your questions for us?
Oh, okay. So
Or can we just...
no. Actually, I want
Eduardo, have a
audience to
question?
be involved in this debate. Hold on. I want audience to be Just type your questions. We are at IGF. Use Twitter. We have hashtags. Like if you have questions for the panelists, because they still have like 10 minutes.
It's IGF 2015 and net neutrality. Right, if you tweet on both of them, we're watching on both of those hashtags.
You want IGF net neutrality? Or?
What is it?
Well, sure, but we have been using both hashtags, and there's not a lot of discussion if you just use both.
Yeah, we are just watching them. So if you have questions for the panelists, I'm gonna pick two very interesting questions, and I want you to be involved. But in the meantime, so you have time as from the member of maybe group. If you have questions for the panelists, or if you want to comment, Bob.
I was asking questions before as the maybe group for both sides. I just wanted to maybe, other than ask questions, I have some comments, but I can hold those if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me give a very concrete, because I think Eduardo said, well, maybe I'm a little bit in the maybe camp because of the technical issues, some of the network management issues. And again, I think part of the problem is that the phrase net neutrality has become so emotional. That's why I liked what Net Mundial did in talking about the open internet and open internet principles. If we can turn down the heat a little bit and actually talk about and very specify what it is we really want in the positive and also what we don't want in the negative, I think we can actually come to a much closer consensus. But let me give you a very concrete example of how things move very, very quickly. Eduardo talked about non-discrimination as being really important. And when we're talking about non-discrimination when it comes to people, yeah, that's sort of tied back into human rights. When we're talking about making sure that anybody has a right to speak, freedom of expression, content that can go end to end without being blocked, all of that. But the word non-discrimination in telecom law, and by the way, in the United States, it's not non-discrimination. It says carriers may not unreasonably discriminate, right? Because there's a recognition that there are different types of traffic that need different types of management and to be approached differently. So, you know, we do this forecast every year which is about everything to do with the internet, the number of people connected and the traffic and what it looks like. And so this year, and we've been doing that for 10 years, and it's a 5-year rolling forecast, and we actually report back how did we do on the forecast, and it's very close. So I'm confident in numbers. But you know I really think we're now at a point of a tale of two networks, and it's not just about congestion. We know that today video is the predominant form of traffic, and we're forecasting in 2019 on fixed networks globally it'll be over 80% to 85% of traffic. Even on mobile with your cell phones and mobile, it's going to be 75% of traffic. So it's all about video, video, and video. It's going to be download video, streaming video. It's going to be two-way video, Skype video. It's going to be you creating video as well as consuming video. So it's producing as well as consuming. But the second tail of the two networks is if you look at the things being connected, the fastest growing category globally are machine-to-machine devices, right? And so globally, we're forecasting 43% by 2019. 43% of all of the things connected to the net are going to be machine-to-machine. And in fact, in some countries, like Japan will be 68%, US 58%, and Korea 72%. Now, what's interesting is, although it'll be 43% of the devices, it's only going to be 3% of the traffic. So we're looking at a completely different type of set of things being connected with different sets of requirements. Some are going to, most of them, by the way, some are going to be continuous, like the security camera, right? When we came in, that's continuous, it's broadband, it has power, it has Ethernet. But most of the things are going to be little things that are going to wake up and chirp little bits of data, go to sleep. Wake up and chirp little bits of data and go to sleep. Some are going to communicate over short distance, some over long distance. Some are going to be broadband. Some are going to be narrowband. Some are going to be continuous. Some are going to chirp. Some are not going to be sensitive to latency. Others, like the device connected to the airbag in your car, it requires very, very low latency. So the set of requirements for all of these, and by the way, we're forecasting in 2019, there's going to be 10.5 billion of these M2M devices connected. So it's about complexity. So you need to manage for both consumption and for both congestion, right? That's the traditional thing we think about. But now we're beginning to see this whole new class of things that are going to have to be managed for complexity as well. And it's important that we have the flexibility in whatever the rules are to be able to do that, right? And what we don't need are well-intentioned ex-ante rules that limit the kind of flexibility for the innovation and the kind of networks we need in the future, while at the same time preserving the principles of the open internet. It's a false choice to say that it has to be either or.
I think you want to comment. You have 30 seconds because I have
right.
to.
So
And then Harold.
it's funny, I realized something that I like things about debates. They can also cause conflict. They can also point out where you agree. I actually realized a little while ago, I wrote the second article on network neutrality in 2004. Tim Wu coined the phrase in 2003. They invited me to write a response. He wrote a response to me. So it's partly my fault to get this debate started. It is not my fault for keeping it going as long as it has. I mean, I will not take that responsibility.
So we blame you.
Yeah, I'll take some responsibility. And in that case, I endorsed a version of network neutrality regulation, but based on ex post case by case. And I think in general, most companies will acknowledge they're committed to the open internet and they're willing to understand some things, to accept a certain amount of regulation as long as it's well formed. Harold brought up a great question, which is no blocking. That's the rule, and I was tempted to say that's one of my rules that I would accept. Then I started thinking about technical problems. So there is a problem they call route flapping. If a route is available, and then it goes down, and then it comes up, and then it goes down, it causes problems with updating the routing tables. So ISPs will take down that site. Are they blocking a website? Yes. Why? Because it's creating technical problems for the network that's causing an enormous problem for updates. Okay, so I'm realizing, okay, we can make a technical exception. They block known sources of malware. and threats into the network, and they'll block sources of DDoS and attempt to mitigate different aspects. And I'm starting to realize, and then the last thing that's really interesting to me is the case that Harold brings up, which is VoIP, I'm really tempted to do as well, but one of the technical realities is because IP is a general service and voice is a specific service, voice is 15 to 20 times more efficient in bandwidth than VoIP. And so one of the technical realities in a very low bandwidth network, that's a problem. Now, for SMS response, probably not. I mean, we're not talking about huge amounts of bandwidth, but starting to get a more refined, would I say no blocking under any circumstances? I don't know if I can say that.
Ask your question.
I will have a very quick response because I know you want to get to the other questions. But my very quick response is I see great consensus, and it is a question of whom do you fear more and whom do you trust more to handle the complexity. My experience is, my perception from the no is we agree in principle, but we believe government is inherently corrupt and will be inherently captured, is inherently incapable of handling complexity, and therefore should be profoundly limited in scope, and the rational order of these things should be that it be handled primarily in the private sector, then through multi-stakeholder processes, and only in implementing the multi-stakeholder processes or as a truly last resort should government ex ante regulation be provided. I believe the world is somewhat more complex than that. I believe that government and industry and civil society interact in a variety of different ways. I have seen the black swan, which is, you tell me nobody will block. This is the problem of a black swan. How many swans do you have to see to prove that swans are not white? Answer, one black swan. Comcast blocked. There's no getting around it. Wireless carriers traditionally blocked. And many still reserve the right to do so, and on occasion do so. So the argument that has been put forward that it will never happen or will only happen in the cases of network security are demonstrably false because they have occurred before. We can argue about the likelihood of again, but they have occurred, so they're not impossible. The issue then becomes, where is the arbitrator of this? As somebody who sits in civil society, I will say, yes, government is frequently flawed. Government is frequently captured. There are great asymmetries of the ability of citizens and others to argue with large corporate powers in the context of government regulation. But ultimately, the only way that we can have an effective means by which these principles are enforced is through government regulation. And therefore, on the whole, I do prefer specific minimum ex ante rules that set the reasonable expectations, and then we move to the complex cases that you have raised, which are no more complex in this context, I would argue, than in numerous other contexts where we have resolved these complexities. All right, my question for you is, so what in the basic regulation, never mind Title II, but what in the basic regulation that the FCC adopted, preferably the 2010 regulation and the 2015 regulation, which, for those not familiar with the general context, the 2010 was a no harmful discrimination standard. The 2015 has 3 bright line rules: no blocking, no degradation, no paid prioritization, and then a 4th catch-all: no getting around these 3 rules through other discriminatory means. So what about those do you think are bad, that you see them as inappropriate?
What I would say, it's hard to say in the rules themselves because they punt so many decisions down the road. The devil is in the details. So one word that's not been spoken in any of the network neutrality panels I've seen here yet is the word specialized services. This is the entire focus of the EU dispute between the European Parliament and the European Council. And the scope of that is going to determine a great deal about how much flexibility is left in the system. So I'll give you several examples of common everyday things that you use that have specialized services. If you have a proprietary video system on DSL in your home, they use specialized services. Otherwise, your only choice is to lay fiber, and we know that's very expensive. If you have a VoIP service that meets ITU standards of quality, which is a 300 millisecond delay, you're using specialized services. You're using dedicated bandwidth to do that. We've been trying to do VoLTE, voice over LTE, over fourth generation phones. If you use VoLTE, they get great quality. They can only do it by reserving bandwidth. And one of the great mysteries in all of this is, if we regulate this in a way that permits, and I'm sure there's other things out there we haven't thought about. Those are just the everyday things that most of us use constantly that do this. If we regulate in a way that permits new experiments like that to occur, I think that we can work within the frameworks of certain of the rules because of things like specialized services and reasonable network management. What the question is what will happen if those are regulated in a restrictive manner? We're not going to be able to do that. And so when you ask who do you trust more? I do think the internet economy has thrived because of decentralized innovation in ways that no one dreamed possible. We all invested in Facebook in the beginning because we knew it was going to be huge. We didn't. And I think we're all smart. No one is so smart to know what's going to succeed in advance. And so what we have to do is create a world in which things are flexible. I want to throw one last point is that we also don't talk much about government as a legitimate stakeholder. And particularly in network neutrality debates, they're often put to the side. I will say to Harold, there are a bunch of interesting issues. One thing that's very important to governments right now is taxation. You see all these people, you're seeing companies taking their operations offshore and it's wiping out their tax base. There are law enforcement, international law enforcement, some legitimate concerns that also need to be taken into account in this debate, which are rarely discussed, and I think that's a problem.
So if you remember two words from what I say today, remember these: flexibility and discretion. The point that has just been made by Christopher is that even when you try to write rigid rules in advance, there will inevitably need to be some room for flexibility. But what it actually ends up meaning, if you try to write a rigid rule, is you end up, the regulator claiming discretion in the future to decide. And it becomes arbitrary. The regulator will say, well, we know that doing this would break important functions, so we're going to leave ourselves discretion in the future to decide how to regulate things like specialized services. That is inevitable, whether it's reasonableness for blocking, for the example Christopher mentioned, or specialized services. At the end of the day, the regulator will decide, probably arbitrarily, in that model, how to make sure that their approach to regulation doesn't break things for consumers. And my fundamental point is, that is not a good model. I do not trust a regulator, especially a special purpose traditional telecommunications regulator that's been designed for monopolies, to have that much discretion. That's why I would prefer dealing with the problem of discretion in several ways. One, as I keep saying, let's preferably have the regulator not be a special one, but a general purpose regulator that is applying standards of general applicability. And the standards of general applicability that I would prefer are those that come from consumer protection and antitrust law, because then when the regulator makes decisions, as it inevitably will, it will have to have discretion, the decisions will be less arbitrary. The regulator will be able to point to standards that are developed that, for example, tell us when a practice is so unfair that it should be banned to consumers. We have a test in the United States for that. We say, does the harm outweigh benefit to consumers? And is the harm something that consumers themselves can't reasonably avoid? If you do cost benefit, and if the harm is something consumers can't avoid, yes, the government can declare the practice harmful. But that's important because that standard of consumer welfare constrains the regulator's discretion. So that's really, at the end of the day, what I'm saying we need, and that's why it's important that the regulator ideally have its discretion constrained, and that where possible, you don't send these decisions to the government, and you have them made in a multi-stakeholder process that both crafts a more flexible code and also handles the arbitration on a case-by-case basis.
So if I could answer the question briefly.
Okay, but you guys will have 1 minute each for your concluding points, and I think we will run 5 minutes late so that your last chance, guys. So if you want to ask a question to the panel, please tweet it now, or it will be never, or you can talk to them. You can find them during the lunch time. So you have like 30 seconds to answer this question.
30 seconds to answer Harold's question. I actually, again, this should not be about U.S. and U.S. law. I agree with the with the 2010 principles that Harold mentioned. That's why maybe I'm in the maybe, because effectively they were the open internet principles. What happened, again, as I mentioned earlier, because of the uniqueness of U.S. law, the FCC was told you can't do it the way they did it, and they ended up doing it a different way, and it's the different way that they did it, which was traditional telecom law, which has all kinds of constraints. Harold said, let's not talk about Title II. Well, that's what that is. That's where I don't agree. It was not the principles. I agree with the principles. They're important, but it's the way in which it's done also is extremely important so that it maintains the flexibility. But these open internet principles broadly, including appropriate network management and innovation, protecting consumers, competition, sufficient information to make decisions and be able to connect your own devices so you can go anywhere on the internet, those are really important because those support these other broader principles, for example, of freedom of expression and human rights, etc. Last point, really briefly. You can't have really binding enforcement without government. So there needs to be a governmental mechanism, even if decisions are made within a multi-stakeholder process. If somebody violates the principles and it is proven, and then the question is, what's the enforcement? It could be by contract, but ultimately that contracts even are going to be enforced by government. So it doesn't mean there's no role for government. It's what's the appropriate role to maintain the flexibility.
Okay, so there is only one question coming from the audience. I'm gonna ask that question to you guys, and you guys have like 30 seconds each, or like in total, let's say 1 minute to answer the question. Whoever wants to answer the question can do so. So the question is, are there examples of network providers restricting freedom of expression, justifying ex-ante regulation? Harold.
Well, Comcast, the largest provider in the United States, explicitly blocked peer-to-peer applications, and particularly BitTorrent, for a period of, I believe it was 1.5 years. They ultimately submitted a detailed explanation of their conduct, including the manner in which they blocked it, which simulated a man-in-the-middle attack. This is on file at the Federal Communications Commission. It is available online, so we do not need to guess. Comcast signed it under penalty of perjury, so we know it is true. So that would be one significant example. There was evidence that other providers at the time were implementing similar blocking schemes and using deep packet inspection in order to be able to block traffic, but they ceased when the Comcast complaint began. Other examples, Simi and Hall.
So what's interesting about the example that Harold uses, which is absolutely correct, is it proves the point you don't need ex-ante regulation. Why? Because the FCC had its principles. As soon as it became evident that Comcast was doing it, it was stopped by the FCC. Stopped dead in its tracks. There was no ex-ante regulation. It was the principles, and it was the application of that, and the FCC intervened immediately and stopped the bad behavior. So again, it's not that there won't be bad behavior. We know there will be. It's how do you do it? And I think that that's an example, but it's also the example of why you don't need ex-ante regulation if you have good visibility, and by the way, nothing is hidden on the internet.
All right. So I have to correct first. What Comcast did is bad. Don't take what I'm saying to contradict that, because they didn't represent correctly. Actually, it's not correct to say that they blocked. They throttled. They used TCP resets, and so the details do matter. What I would say, though, is in the other examples that are commonly given are often not internet examples, and I'm happy to talk about that. The other thing is, the question was, is this an example of them doing it against free expression? And you could say that they were attempting to curb speech, and it might have had that effect. It was really a business decision. You could say they're protecting video because they're a video provider. The other reality is BitTorrent is engineered a way that it expands to fill all available bandwidth in ways that machine-to-machine things do. And in fact, it was a problem. Well, they can, not all of them do, but it's a particular problem because without any incentive, they had no means of metering actually BitTorrent. And the problem is, if you're in a node with 50 people, 5 minutes BitTorrent users can actually clog your entire site. And so there's a couple of explanations here. We have to get to the bottom. It's quite complicated to get to the bottom of them. There are examples where I think are problematic. There was a reported example in Canada where a network provider blocked access to a labor union site with whom they were having a labor dispute. I can't deny that these are possibilities. An interesting question is what's the right way to do it? And is it so prevalent that we would create a general network neutrality rule as opposed to one in certain circumstances?
I know we take questions from the audience, but we'll just briefly say, is this working? Yeah. We'll just briefly say that the other thing the Comcast example proves is that there were other laws on the books that could have addressed that problem. Our consumer protection regulator could have addressed that case. What Comcast was doing was clearly deceptive. It was a purely political decision that the person who was running the FCC at the time decided he was going to decide the question rather than allowing it to be decided by the general consumer protection regulator. I think that was a mistake, and it was the thing that really fundamentally derailed the conversation in the United States, which could otherwise have been about how we use existing laws.
Okay, so we have 3 very interesting questions from the audience, and one of them is for you, Harold, specifically for you. So you are the most popular guy on this panel. So first one is it's for all the panelists. So net neutrality is such a gloriously indefinite term supported by everyone, whatever they define it to be. What is your definition? And you have only 140 characters because we are answering the tweet question. So you are assume that you are answering the question on Twitter. Okay. Very short. Who wants to start? What is your definition of net neutrality, Bob?
I've already said it. It's the open internet as described in the going forward document from the Net Mundial.
Great. Eduardo, Harold?
When my students ask that question to me, I say my first reaction is, well, it's not an agreement on that, but I always read the model framework designed here at the IGF level.
Business practices that disadvantage certain actors in a way that hurt consumers. That means not justified by cost and not justified in a market where it's a good business strategy to differentiate what you're offering instead of just doing the same thing as everyone else.
Do you have a definition?
Well, that's how it should be defined, but of course we're the no camp, and so we're saying no to the prevailing definition, which is very different from that. The prevailing definition, essentially, if I put it simply, is we know what the internet should look like. It looks like something that we think of today that should never change, and we should write that into law today. And that's why I'm saying no.
Okay, Harold, this is your question. So
Didn't I get to answer the other one first?
Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think John Oliver speaks for me.
Okay, so your special question is coming here. So by whom, at which level would you like to see regulation? Nationally, regionally, internationally?
I believe that as an initial matter, it requires national legislation. I think every country is different, and the questions of within the scope of the general principles that we are discussing, how they're implemented, is something that will need to be decided on a national basis. I do think that there appears to be broad international consensus, and I would hope that things like multi-stakeholder processes, which we certainly support and applaud, inform the process of national legislation.
Okay. So, and the last question is for everyone. Does no party think standards can be enforced without government involvement?
The question, if I may, I'll answer. The question was,
But
doesn't government need to enforce standards? Of course. I mean, that's what I've been saying here like many times, right? So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that government shouldn't have a role. I'm saying it really matters what that role is. And my best case scenario is that government doesn't write the standard, and a telecom regulator is not involved, but you have the general purpose Competition and Consumer Protection Authority that enforces standards. That's the best case scenario for me, but of course, that still means there's a role for government.
Okay, 5 tweets from Berin. Christopher?
I guess because this is the IGF, I would say, though, is they're not the only actor. Industry best practices can actually resolve a great deal of this, can actually become part of the lawmaking process. An active discourse in many different ways. In this day and era, standard-setting organizations are often, international standard-setting organizations are often more influential than any government, any one government. And so what we start to see is a much more complex set of interactions between actors that I think is much more interesting than asking whether governments, which level should be.
Bob?
So the question was about standards. And actually, if you look at some of the most effective standards, governments have had very little, if anything, in some cases, nothing to do with them, like IETF standards, the technical standards, or even the standards coming out of 3GPP, which created, 3G, 4G mobile service. So I do think that they're actually standards development, standards enforcement is largely, on the technical side, multi-stakeholder. If we're talking about enforcement against bad behavior, as I said earlier, at the end of the day, there needs to be a government role in enforcing actions against bad behavior, that whether it's through a private mechanism or a government mechanism.
Eduardo? Mike?
If we believe that the government should have some role, the role should be based on some previous regulation. And the Comcast example that you gave here, when FCC stopped, it stopped because there was something before, some regulations that allows FCC to act. If not, it's impossible to FCC to act. So if you're saying, well, FCC at that point did something, even without having proper net neutrality regulation, well, I agree, but there was something that was the basis to act. So at the end, we are believing in regulation.
Harold?
What we mean by standards is another one of these exciting questions. If we are talking about technical standards like IPv6 versus standards of conduct and standards of behavior, I think that government has generally been less successful at choosing specific standards, although I can point to cases where the choice of standard was somewhat arbitrary, but there needed to be one uniform standard. The digital television conversion is such a case, for example. But the broader question about the role here of the enforcement, I think, is exactly right. And I do not share Barron's distrust of telecom regulators. I think that expertise in this area is necessary. Our difference of opinion derives in part as to our theory of what happens in government and how government operates. And I will reserve that argument for another time.
Before we take the vote, I just want to say two quick things. Number one, at 2 o'clock, we're having a discussion on the economics of deployment. Please come to that. It's in room 8. And two, if anybody wants to talk about starting a dynamic coalition on deployment, come talk to me.
Okay, vote time. So, when we first started, we asked you, net neutrality, yes, no, or maybe. So we want to hear back from you after this super fun panel and rock star panelists, whether you change your mind. So who says yes? Let's see the yeses. Okay, how many? People are changing their minds. Don't change your minds. If you are yes, you are yes. 16, 17, 18. Don't change your mind. Are you yes? Yes, okay. 18, 19, 20. Okay, we have 20 yeses. Who says no? Okay.
No.
No. 9. Okay. How about the maybes? Oh. Yeah. No. 11? 11. Okay. So when we first started, we had like 10 yeses. Now we made it to 20. Congratulations, yes camp. You have like 10 more supporters.
But ask who changed their mind.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Vote for
Okay. So, and then we have, like, when we first started, we had, like, 6 no's. Now they have 9 no's. So there are, congratulations, too. Yeah. But yeah. I mean, everyone left because we are tempo escodato. Okay. So when we first started, we had like 14 maybes. Now we only have 11. So sorry, Bob, but your panelist left early. You know, he wasn't a fighter. So, but before we left, I want to ask you whether you enjoyed this panel. Okay, great. And we also enjoyed having you here. And one last question: who changed their minds? Okay, let's see the. 1, 2, 3, 4. Only 4 brave people accept the fact that they changed their life. Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch.